Bonjour à toutes et à tous, bienvenue à cette discussion organisée dans le cadre de la 23e édition des rencontres internationales du documentaire de Montréal, les RIDM, qui se déroule actuellement entièrement en ligne jusqu'au 2 décembre. Mon nom est Charlotte Selb, je suis programmatrice au RIDM et je suis très heureuse de vous accueillir à cette discussion en ligne. J'avais très hâte de la modérer. Donc, c'est une discussion qui va porter sur les films Landfall, présentés dans le cadre de la section Contester le pouvoir du 19 au 25 novembre, et Bicentenario, présenté dans la section Confronter l'histoire du 12 au 18 novembre. Cette discussion va se dérouler en anglais, bien que nos deux cinéastes soient plutôt hispanophones, mais on va trouver une langue pour nous rassembler tous. Et donc, je me permets de changer vers l'anglais pour vous introduire nos invités. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Cecilia Aldarondo, the filmmaker behind Landfall. Welcome, Cecilia.
Thank you.
As well as Pablo Alvarez, the director of Bicentenario. Welcome, Pablo.
Thank you, Charlotte.
So at first sight, your two films can seem to have little in common. Landfall is an in-depth analysis of the interconnection between the economic and the environmental crisis in Puerto Rico, while Bicentenario is a reflection on the figure of Simón Bolívar in Colombia's collective consciousness. I do believe, though, that these films are a common feature that we're going to be able to discuss. And to begin with, I have to reveal that it's not a pure coincidence if we brought the two of you together today, because you know each other. Pablo actually shot Cecilia's film, Landfall. He acted as a cinematographer. So I'm going to start with that. Pablo, how did you come to collaborate on Cecilia's film? What brought the two of you together?
It was, I think I was at RIDM, right? Cecilia, and we have many common friends, and somehow Cecilia was looking for somebody who spoke Spanish to go down and shoot, and they reached me, and it was a quick, because the Hurricane Maria, which the film is partly about, just had happened, and the need to shoot was urgent, and it was something like, let's go and shoot tomorrow kind of thing. And I was like, and the country was still shut down. There was just first aid responders, we're the only ones in, so we couldn't do it for a little bit. But then we started speaking more in depth of what was happening there and the urgency to shoot and all this. And soon enough, a few weeks later, we went down to Puerto Rico, and that was the first of 4 shoots, I think it was, over a period of a year and a half or 2. And yeah, I mean, yeah, and this film, and it became for me an incredible learning experience and collaboration with somebody now who I extremely admire and respect and look forward to for many things. And it was an incredible pleasure to work in the film and to have the privilege to through the camera bring some things to light, and then Cecilia to make what she made with the images was incredible to see, and that's how it went.
Cecilia, how did you enjoy the collaboration?
Well, it's so funny to hear. I feel like this is how memory works, is that you have these sort of parallel narratives, and in many ways Pablo and I are both very interested in the topic of memory, so I love to hear his version of things. I was on the other side in New York with mutual friends, basically crying about the hurricane and what could I do, and I wanted to make a film, and I said I need to find somebody that I trust who can shoot really well, and they said immediately Pablo, and I was like, who's this Pablo? And they put us into contact, and as Pablo was saying, I think for me, one of the things that I noticed immediately just in having conversations was Pablo was asking all the right questions. I think he was very concerned with the possibility of people sort of parachuting into a very vulnerable situation. Again, things in Puerto Rico at the time we began making the film were incredibly chaotic, and I certainly didn't want to burden anyone, or neither of us are those kinds of filmmakers that sort of go into, we're not war journalists or anything like this. But it was very striking to me that he was already very concerned with not being exploitative. And I think that sensibility, permeated the film and really enabled us to have a very meaningful ongoing dialogue about, as we were shooting. I always prefer to work with people who are artists in their own right, with their own artistic practice, and not simply, technically minded. And this was one of the things that Pablo brought, was this incredible, aesthetic sensibility, and a deep understanding of Latin American politics, which he has, lived personally. So even though it was a very crazy thing, we met in person for the first time in the airport in San Juan, and but I'm just very grateful that I was able to have a team of people, including Pablo, who were very engaged, very mindful, and also just aesthetically very, very rigorous, and understanding that the way you frame a shot has an ethical component to it. It's not just about how something looks or comes across. There's a politics to the way you shoot and the way you edit and the way you you craft a film. So that was a real joy for me, in not feeling alone in wanting to make a film that was very carefully constructed.
It's a beautiful story. We need those these days. So I'd like to follow up with a question about your two films. Both of your films are traveling through a specific landscape, and I'd like to know how you decided on that itinerary. Can you talk a little bit about the whole research process that led you to these specific spaces?
Ceci, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, so I felt from the very beginning that I wanted to make a film that would have a kind of holistic scope. Part of what I was very aware of is that, outside of Puerto Rico, particularly in the United States, which is the colonizing body that controls Puerto Rico, there is an incredible amount of ignorance about this place. And even though I was interested in exploring the aftermath of the hurricane, part of my goal was insisting that you can't understand the aftermath of the hurricane without understanding the much longer arc of colonial history, the very complicated pre-existing conditions that the hurricane only exacerbated. And so I wanted to make a film that would have a kind of intersectionality to it, a kind of holistic sweep that would enable things that we maybe think of as not connected to be connected. And one of the ways that seemed possible, and I also wanted to make a film that would feel very much like it was told first and foremost for people in Puerto Rico, and kind of encouraged a sort of a grassroots gaze from within, a community-minded film that wasn't simply putting Puerto Rico on display for people outside. And so all of those things made me think that a kind of travel log, a series of vignettes that would connect, that would be traveling around Puerto Rico, would be the most effective strategy. And some of it was very particularly planned, like, okay, I knew I wanted to tackle things like disaster capitalism and the relationship between the hurricane and, say, something like real estate. So very early on, we identified this real estate family to shoot with, and there were certain aspects of the story, for example, the military history in the island of Vieques, that we just knew wanted to be in there, but how we actually determined where to shoot and what had a lot of trial and error and serendipity to it as well. And we really kind of planned it along the way. It wasn't also, I just want to note that it wasn't just Pablo who was very involved in the collaboration, but Lale Namoro Pastor, who's an activist based in Puerto Rico, whose voice actually carries the film. It's sort of quietly framed. The film is quietly framed as a conversation between me and Lale. So it was really me and Pablo and Lale for a lot of it. Having these ideas of what we wanted to shoot, and then stepping back and saying, okay, what do we have? What do we need? And how do we round out the picture and have a kind of diversity of places, diversity of locations, races of people, ages of people, perspectives. So it was, but it was both planned and in many ways unplanned. And I think that's one of the things that can be most beautiful about not only traveling, but also documentary filmmaking, that it can, the moments of serendipity and surprise, if you're open to them, are what I think makes this particular mode of filmmaking unique.
What about you, Pablo?
Bicentenario came about as the Bicentenario is happening. I wanted to follow the liberation campaign that Bolivar took. It was very important for me to actually be in the place, in the territory, and shoot through the territory, the celebrations that were about to happen, with the curiosity of what is actually being celebrated when we celebrate something like the Bicentenary. Then it became like Cecilia's film, sort of like a very embodied exploration of the territory, where the film travels through the land to enhance the fact that the territory is a political space, and that the liberation of Latin America, or of Colombia in particular, and like Bolivar's journey through it, has legacies that we're still living until now. And from there, yeah, it was following the path of Bolivar through Colombia all the way to Bogota.
Yeah, thank you. So that leads me to my next question. Both of you are traveling back to your native place or your place of origin. Pablo, you're Colombian living in Montreal, and Cecilia, you're of Puerto Rican background, and you're living in the Hudson Valley. So what's your take on diasporic cinema? Do you feel like it informs your practice aesthetically and politically, of course? Cecilia.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, this question is an ethical question, because I think we're living in a moment, at least in the United States, where there's a tremendous amount of discussion about who is has the license to tell a story, and who has the right to really take the camera on, and also, you know, give voice to a situation, is a phrase that's often used. And I think for me, to be the product of diaspora is to already in and of itself be in a complicated relationship to that question, because well, on the one hand, I'm very much the product of colonialism. You know, my family is in the diaspora, like many millions of people from Puerto Rico, because the economic conditions of colonialism meant that people wanted to leave to find a better life. Not because we necessarily wanted to. So I've never lived in Puerto Rico, not one day of my life. I've visited my family very much, and it's a place that I feel both very tied to and very, before making this film anyway, I knew I had a lot of blind spots and a lot of confusion. And that is partly why working with Lale was so central to making the film, because Lale, by contrast, has lived their whole life in Puerto Rico, apart from a little bit of time outside. And so the collaboration on that front was very important, to sort of situate myself vis-a-vis the material and not presume to know things I didn't know. But I would also say that, you know, Pablo's role in the making of the film was also really vital. I mean, we would talk fairly candidly about the ways in which him, as somebody who grew up in Latin America, who'd never been to Puerto Rico before, but who grew up in Latin America, had a particular kind of keen sensibility about what was unfolding. And there would be times when Lala and I would be getting caught up in, you know, sort of, you could say, factional arguments between, you know, people there and people here. And we would get in these debates, and sometimes it took someone like Pablo, who wasn't directly from the community, really in any you know, clear way, to provide a fresh perspective. So anyway, that's how I think about the diasporic question. It's sort of it can be a pitfall, I think, to sort of return home to a place that perhaps you haven't been for many years, and then presume to be somehow definitive on that place. But I also think that kind of perspective can be also incredibly vital. So yeah.
Pablo?
Yeah, it's a weird and definitely fundamental question. It's like I feel distance. I mean, Colombia, since I left, has gone through like waves of like violence and like some weird sort of like mirage of peace. Definitely in the last 5 years, there was the signing of the peace process, and there was like this hope that the country would start to come to terms with the past and start to move towards an actually like an ideal or like a collective future, like one that was actually purposefully thought of, where it's like as would be if a country comes together and signs a peace process that has been after a war of 50 years, which was after like 500 years of problems. So like something like a peace process is the most incredible opportunity for a country to have a like group therapy and come to terms with the deeper, like, you know, rooted like problems that we've had. I say that because for a few years, yeah, and I have made films in Colombia, but I was, you know, like making films here too and such. But after 2016, when the peace process like fell through and there was a referendum, and half of the country decided that we were not interested in making peace with the guerrillas and a big conflict, it was absolutely necessary to get involved in participating in the conversation surrounding what that country is and how do we see each other, and having a conversation that is actually what I feel will be the network and the tools to come with it won't then be a peace process like a signed document as we had the chance to, but it will be through gestures of like these films try to suggest of like re-evaluating our history, our colonial legacy, and those histories effects in the present and in the future. So like if we don't then go back and actually like do some sort of cleanse somehow, we will never be able to move forward. So it is impossible not to go back and make films and participate actively in a country like that. So so that is how I'm dealing with filmmaking from abroad right now, in terms of looking at Colombia.
Yeah, this directly takes me to my next question. As you said, both of your films are exploring a colonial heritage and the way it informs the present, everyday life, state structures, and collective consciousness. But your respective approaches are very different. Cecilia, you are making a concrete, precise sociopolitical and economic analysis, but Pablo, you decided to stay in the realm of the supernatural and the unconscious. So can you talk a little bit about the discourse that you're having on the historical heritage and your choice of approach to it?
Yeah, and I think that's what I was coming to with the last piece, was how then if again after seeing the extremely disappointing results of the bureaucratic and like, you know, intention of the peace process, and that falls through, then it makes you question what is underneath us that we cannot move forward. And then the Bicentenario comes through, and the celebration of a liberation comes through, and then you start looking closer into what is that liberation, how did it come through, and you start seeing a lot of violence, and it is violence over the violence of the conquista, of the conquistadors. So we have been in over, again, 500 years of different iterations of violence that establish powers over people. And for me, then it was that became the form of the film, like going then deeper to what are those structures that are creating rituals through which we cannot escape from. And those are celebrations of political, historical political events, such as the Bicentenary that happens every year. And with it comes an extremely belligerent perspective over our past, our present, and then the future. Like if our heroes are generals who have a very, very questionable records, like Bolivar, who of course did, like, he was the general and the leader in the liberation, but he was not the only one, and definitely the liberation did not necessarily happen because of him, and without him it would have happened anyway. So I don't think I'm suggesting a historical alternative. I'm just questioning the methods, and it is dangerous again to use the political ritual of a liberation to enhance and to instill more warring and more belligerent unconsciousness throughout the world, throughout Colombia. So then that became part of like the treatment of like, then let's go through tackling that unconscious and then seeing those rituals as actual, on one hand, monuments, physical monuments, and on the other hand, cultural monuments that become archives that we internalize and that carry on the cycles of violence and that we cannot escape. So it becomes, then the film becomes eventually an exorcism of those rituals. How can we exercise our sort of like imposed legacies so we can actually escape and reimagine alternative futures? Those statues of Bolivar could have been an array of different people that actually had like quite an important role in the liberation, and would have had a very interesting effect in our present and in our past, and then in the futures. So how can we replace those monuments for different monuments, both up in the pedestals in front of churches and in our minds and in our politics? So that's the treatment of the film.
Thank you. What about you, Cecilia?
I mean, I think that we are completely aligned, I think, in what we care about. And, I love this idea of, I forget how you put it exactly, Pablo, this idea that we need to have an exorcism in order to find political alternatives. The same, I would say, is entirely true for Puerto Rico. And when we were editing the film, Tara, who Pablo also knows, who I worked with to edit the film, we put on the board something that said, "This is an old story," and it was a very important kind of thing we were continuing to return to. And this is partly why the film has these archival sequences, but it also has, it spends time in places that are very loaded, and in many ways, the landscape is literally haunted. And it sounds weird to think of something as being literally haunted, but I think that when there are bombs that are still in the water from the U.S. military intervention, as they are in Vieques, I feel like that's actually a literal haunting of the landscape. And I don't think we think enough about how concrete ghosts can be. And I think it was something that, for me, I think in terms of the film being a little bit more concrete in its politics than Pablo's is partly because for me, making this particular film at this particular moment, the immediate aftermath of the hurricane and the political urgency of Puerto Rico's day-to-day, just sort of, even though if anything, we fought to make sure that the film had metaphorical sequences, more implicit meanings alongside, but we felt very strongly that the film had to have a very clear-cut set of kind of informational aspects to it, because in the current president of Puerto Rico, especially when you're dealing with such an immediately traumatized population, it just felt like Puerto Rico hadn't had a film like this yet, and it needed a film that people could see as widely as possible. And in a way, the film operates a little bit like a political pamphlet in that regard, where it's just sort of informing you about the political reality. But at the same time, I would say my artistic sensibilities are very much, in keeping with Pablo's, in terms of wanting to go deeper, thematically and metaphorically. And it actually reminds me of a sequence that didn't end up in the film that Pablo shot. You're talking about statues. I keep thinking about this statue of Christopher Columbus. That's the largest statue of Christopher Columbus in the Western Hemisphere, and it's in Puerto Rico. and it is absolutely enormous. It looks like from far away, it looks like a knife in the landscape. It's an incredibly violent statue, and it just looms over Puerto Rico. And anyway, it's I think that the themes that Pablo is talking about are very much ones that we're also trying to signal. This, we go 500 years back at least in order to understand our present.
All right. So I like this idea of exorcism that you're both talking about, but in your case, Pablo, it's something you pushed pretty far because you actually worked with real mediums, right? Who invoked the spirit of Simon Bolivar. So I'm sure everybody who's seen the film or who are planning to will want to know more about that practice that you develop. It's pretty uncommon in documentary filmmaking. How did you meet those mediums and how did you work with them?
Yeah, it was like a multi strategy approach to finding them, because it's very interesting. It's like in Colombia we have a saying that like I forget it in Spanish because my languages are all mixed up, but it's something like that they are witches, we don't see them but they're there somehow, and it is true. Like, they are there, and then you go and ask and walk around and go to the places that like that somebody says that there's a witch down the street, and then you go to down the street and they tell you, yeah, she lives down there, and you go there, and then like you start looping around the little square of the town, and they disappear. Like, they actually don't exist, that because they're taking cover from stigma. So witches are an interesting, and I say that because it was an interesting point of narrative for me, because they have escaped the colonial power, and they escaped the liberation campaign, and they were like in the center of like they're like these entities of like a point of view that were an interesting perspective over the liberation. I then eventually like found a few mediums who we did actually like mediating and calling for the spirit of Bolivar. With them, I recorded the sessions, and it was very interesting. At some point, I thought that the film was just going to be those mediums, but then it was better to aesthetically to re-record it with another medium in Montreal, who we did eventually another session, and then with the best pieces of the chunks that I had done in Colombia, we did it together, and we recorded that as the main narrative arc of the film. That was needed to, as I said, to tackle the unconscious of the country, and to have an antidote to those rituals that are imposed on us as with the Bicentenario happening every year. And yeah, that's how they came through, and
you may have started a new trend. Who knows? It opens a lot of possibilities for documentary filmmaking.
It's interesting because it's a real space as well. It is a real space of documenting an oral history. It is, again, like a voice that has escaped a bunch of different pressures and a bunch of different like encasements of ideas. And no matter if you believe in the mediation or not, the point of view of a medium will be one of remembering like what they know of Bolivar, or actually channeling Bolivar. So either or is an interesting and revelatory perspective on how we imagine or how we like channel Bolivar in our realities.
So you see it as a form of resistance in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because again, like mediums themselves, they have been in resistance to like church and to many different societal pressures, and then as all the other oral histories that I try to bring into the film, it is a resistance to a history that is like a very clean and very specific point of view of history, and those histories are important, and those stories are what actually tell the territory. Like, it's speaking from the territory rather than speaking from the rituals that those governments try to impose.
Cecilia, do you want to react to those few thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking of, I was just attending another panel where somebody was talking about doing archival research, and she spoke about how the archive, the records that had endured, there were not very many stories of African Americans or people of color. And she said, you know, I wish that I could have included more of these stories, but I have to go with what the record holds. And to me, that is such a perennial problem when you're talking about something like a colonial past, where what remains in the official record is very often it's you know, my whole career I've been thinking about what is missing from that official record, what is missing from the archive. And then for me, as a colonial, you know, a byproduct of colonialism, I have come to understand really through making this film just how much I've been robbed of my own history and memory. And you know, there's a wonderful moment in this film by Tatiana Hueso, El lugar más pequeño, the tiniest place.
Beautiful film.
Yeah, she says something like, un pueblo que no tiene memoria es más fácil que sea un pueblo sometido, which is something like a people without memory are easier to dominate or control. And I think in this case, Pablo, what you're talking about is the importance of constantly, as you're saying, with oral history, with ghosts, with mediums. I think that these are really important methodologies for going against the grain of the official received history. And I think that part of what we're both concerned with is we can only, if we're only fixated on fixing the present, but we're not informing ourselves with what needs to be redeemed from the past, we'll never be free. So that's part of what I'm hearing, and I think in many ways Landfall is aligned with that project.
Mm-hmm.
When finding the mediums, with the very first encounter that we had, we found this woman who told me the ghosts appear everywhere. Be very careful where you shoot and how you record. Before every single recording and every single actuating of the camera, settle down and give it, 10 to 20 seconds for the souls to settle down, and they will reveal, they will come. So Bolivar will come. You will be able to record Bolivar and shoot his spirit. Be very careful, because Bolivar, or the spirits, are not present in the present. They're revealed through these machines, so through the video camera, or through a film camera in this case, or through the audio, which was like an interesting also parallel to the archives. So like I was somehow, so then that's how I then approached the filmmaking of or the capturing of these landscapes, with the knowledge that Bolivar might come in and leaving the camera with the Bolex is 30 seconds of rolling. So each single shot, no matter what I was shooting, I knew that I was actually like looking for the potential of Bolivar appearing somehow. And the same with the recording mechanism. So, but I knew then I was making a film that was itself an archive. So what I was shooting in the present was what I was gonna capture later. So I did not know what I was capturing, because Bolivar again doesn't appear, or like spirits don't appear in the present. They show up later in the medium. So that became a way of thinking about the film, and sort of like stretching temporalities, and which became also again like embedded with the treatment and the subject matter in the film throughout the process. I had also a medium who was a tarot reader, who became what we would commonly know as a creative producer. She would read sort of like what I would need for the film, without concretely talking about or saying anything, but like she was like a guide, a creative guide somehow. And that went on through the whole process. So the idea of the mediums were from the beginning to end, like actually guiding the process throughout the making of the film.
I'm gonna jump on something a little bit different, and it's mainly about your film, Cecilia. I'm sure. So your film got released first at Tribeca, right? So back in March, and you've been traveling, if we can say, with the film. The film has been traveling around the world, and you probably heard a lot that since the pandemic began, your film is very timely because it offers an analysis of disaster capitalism, and we're kind of living in a disaster right now. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that. In what way do you feel like your film speaks of what's taking place right now in the world? And can you maybe offer some insights into what we've been witnessing since the pandemic began?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think one of the things that's been honestly one of the most challenging, I mean, there have been a lot of things that are challenging, obviously, about this pandemic time. And in many ways, I think we're lucky that we work in an art form that can adapt to this moment. Like, I just think about all these people who are live performers, musicians, dancers, actors, etc., who so in a lot of ways, Landfall has been able to adapt to the reality. But at the same time, one of the unfortunate paradoxes is that the pandemic has diminished our ability for the film to reach audiences in the way that it would have. For example, just press. I mean, you say world premiered at Tribeca. Tribeca never happened. They didn't actually hold the festival. So that's been one of the things that we've been actually swimming upstream on is frankly how to make sure that this story, which is entirely relevant to this moment, is actually being seen and experienced and talked about. And I will say that the people who have seen the film, very much agree with you in that, and even before the pandemic started, I was, as I was making the film, I was constantly telling, whether it was potential funders or anyone, that Puerto Rico is like a handbook for our times. And it's partly that it's such part of what happens, I think, in relatively small places is that you can see forces at work that might not otherwise be so legible. And so, for example, in a place like Puerto Rico, you can understand and see very plainly how it is that opportunists come in at moments of incredible societal fragility. You see how, the question of, for example, to take this moment, the question of what constitutes a just recovery. What is, we are facing, at least in the United States, we're staring down the barrel of a kind of austerity program that the likes of which we probably have not seen in our lifetimes. I mean, universities are going to be on the brink of collapse. The art system, so many, as the economy goes through what it's going through, we are going to witness, I really see coming this very intense divide on who actually deserves to be helped and how we go ahead and what programs we develop. Do we take a kind of New Deal approach where the state actually unveils all kinds of job opportunities for people and says, no, we actually really need to come together as a country and make this a recovery for everyone? Or do we take a vastly neoliberal approach, which is the one they've taken in Puerto Rico, which is to privatize everything in the name of paying an illegal debt? That is the approach that has been undertaken. The constant refrain in Puerto Rico is, we can't afford it. We have to privatize our schools. We have to privatize our healthcare system. We have to privatize everything, literally everything. And that, I think, is, where we are witnessing this moment where capitalism, I think, is rearing its head to such an extreme. And I think it's really going to be a battle for the soul of everything we believe in. And I think Puerto Rico is a really useful place for people to understand what is coming. And I think part of what Americans in particular we're not used to this amount of fragility. And this, that's a part of the reason I think people in this pandemic time in the US are so overwhelmed and freaked out is because a lot of privileged people don't know what it's like to suffer. And so there's a kind of blindness to forces, I think, but communities that know austerity, communities that know risk and vulnerability and fragility, many of whom live in the United States, I'm not just talking about Latin America or other parts of the world, communities that have survived chronic underfunding, underdevelopment, know what to do. And so I think that that's the other side of this too, is a place like Puerto Rico is an incredible place for seeing alternatives and seeing how people can organize and come together and fight for the world that they believe in. So it's not all entirely, I mean, it is apocalyptic, but I think that there are also really incredible models for resistance and for pleasure and for joy and for community. And so anyway, yeah, that's basically the task that I'm on right now, is to try and, as loudly as possible, insist that Puerto Rico not fade into the background, which it's always doing. And in the pandemic, it's only fading even more. But in fact, to say, no, it's actually, we could learn a lot from Puerto Rico.
Right. Maybe to start wrapping the conversation, I'd like to hear both of your reflections on the way the pandemic affects the work of documentary filmmakers. Cecilia, you touched a little bit on the distribution of your film, but there's the whole production aspect as well. It's obviously documentary filmmakers are used to meeting people and traveling and, long time proximity. So it's a lot of things that are challenged right now.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
I think. Go ahead.
I'll be brief. I should be shooting the second part now. It's the wet season in Colombia, and the second film is partly, or it is shot during the wet season, and so I will be already like 8 months or so behind schedule. And I am not the only one, though. I mean, it is, of course, we're all in this pause or reevaluation of so many things, and yeah, I have been using it to write and to develop the film and to do other things that I guess have to be done. But yeah, it's a tricky time for sure, and like not like having the films and having, like, to bring a positive thing, bringing a film to an online festival at the beginning was a little bit frustrating. I feel, though, there's interesting aspects of the fact of coming into individual people's spaces, and for example a film like Bicentenario that is trying to evoke a certain environment. It's interesting. I feel it's a weird shift in how we're then experiencing the film, which was definitely unplanned, but it's an interesting alternative and doesn't replace the cinema and group experience of a film by far. But I'm trying to take the best of it somehow. Ceci, what are your ideas?
I have a far more pessimistic view. I think. I mean, I think this is only driven home my love of cinema and cinema spaces in particular. My first job after I graduated college was at a film festival as a programming assistant, and I really discovered documentary film through that job. And it was I loved watching people watching films together. That was one of the great pleasures of working at a film festival. So I'm going to be a diehard and insist that that we need to make sure that our cinema culture survives this. I will also say, I'm based in the US, and the infrastructure for making particularly creative nonfiction that maybe, breaks certain boundaries and isn't the most conventional, the infrastructure has not been sustainable for a long time for filmmakers. And the ways that we make our films, the bread and butter mechanics of it, I really fear are only going to be that much more challenged. We have no state film apparatus, for example. the closest we have is we have public media, which funded Landfall, but you can, I was told at the beginning of my orientation for ITVS funding was it's easier to get into Yale University than it is to get ITVS funding. It is incredibly competitive, and there's just not enough. So there wasn't enough beforehand. So I recently, I co-authored an article in Hyperallergic magazine with a filmmaker named Robert Greene. It's called "Where Does Independent Documentary Go From Here?" And in there, I'm pretty much worrying about what will befall us. I think I really want us to radically rethink the economics of this work, because I firmly believe that that filmmaker independence, that creative, artful filmmaking is essential to a healthy democracy. And the way things are trending in our media landscape, not just film in general, I think that, we have a lot to be concerned about and to organize around. And so I've spent a lot of my energy connecting with other similarly afflicted filmmakers in the United States, and we've begun to organize and really try and figure out how we're going to help one another, because yeah, I'm not exactly, well, I'll say again, what I learned in Puerto Rico is the best thing we have is each other. And that is what I'm relying on to see where this all takes us.
And I will just add, I totally agree. And I was just saying, I just came from a seminar, we're talking and coming also with, it's in Latin America, and coming with really interesting solutions and a way more collective and horizontal way of thinking of not only making but sharing and watching, and rethinking how does the festival world and works with films, and I'm sure both ends and distribution will shift some levers, because it was not sustainable as it was before. And I think this is an interesting point, definitely a spot for all of us to see how can we navigate and move forward, and definitely through collaboration, and definitely through actual action. And it's coming through filmmakers actually, and through filmmakers unions, and because of these online encounters that we're having, almost to an extreme, and they're a little bit maybe exhausting and whatnot, but it is bridging voices and perspectives that I think in the prior festival world maybe they were not happening. And it is a conversation that had been due, it's been quite overdue actually. And I feel that there is something going on.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add that I think that documentary filmmakers, in my experience, and I don't want to totally generalize, but we're often far better at thinking collectively in terms of the films that we make, the content, who we make films about, or the communities and stories we want to explore. And I think that in terms of behind the camera, we're deeply individualistic, deeply competitive. We're sort of conditioned to fight each other tooth and nail for the little bit of support that we can get. And I think that this is a big wake-up call, this moment, for filmmakers to recognize that, it's just not working for a small handful of filmmakers to sort of break through. And so yeah, I do feel some optimism around that at least there's a kind of awakening, I think, to the realities of our ecosystem.
Well, thanks for sharing your optimism and your thoughts. I'm gonna wish you guys the best of luck in all your projects. I hope you're gonna be able to achieve whatever you have planned. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion. It was a wonderful discussion. I hope we're going to be able to see you in person very soon. And just a reminder to our audience, the films are available on our platform, enligne.ridm.ca. So in French, nos films sont disponibles sur notre plateforme, enligne.ridm.ca. So thank you everybody, merci beaucoup et bon festival. À bientôt.
Thank you.